The fluorescent lights in the office buzzed with that particular frequency that Eleanor Graves had come to associate with the slow draining of her soul. It was a sound she had never noticed when she first started working at Hartwell and Associates 7 years ago. But now it was all she could hear. That persistent, invisible hum that seemed to vibrate right behind her eyes, settling into the space between her thoughts like static on an old television screen. She sat at her desk, fingers paused over her keyboard, staring at the email she had just received from Marcus Whitfield, the senior project manager. The subject line read, in all capital letters, urgent, REVISIONS, needed by tomorrow AM. She hadn't even opened it yet. She already knew what it would contain. It would contain the same thing it always contained. A list of changes that contradicted the list of changes he had requested the previous week, which had contradicted the list of changes from the week before that. It was an endless ouroboros of revision, a snake eating its own tail, and Eleanor was the tail. Around her, the open plan office hummed with the orchestrated chaos of late afternoon. Phones rang in staccato bursts. Keyboards clattered like mechanical rain. Somewhere to her left, Brenda from accounting was having one of her whispered, but somehow still audible personal calls. The kind where she kept saying, I know, in a tone that suggested she actually knew nothing at all. To her right, the new hire, a young man named Tyler, who still had the bright-eyed enthusiasm of someone who hadn't yet been ground down by the machinery of corporate life, was aggressively typing as though his performance review depended on the sheer volume of keystrokes he could produce in an hour. Eleanor finally clicked on the email. As expected, Marcus wanted the formatting changed back to the original style they had used 3 versions ago. He wanted the executive summary expanded, but also condensed. He wanted more data, but less detail. He wanted the tone to be more authoritative, but also approachable, and formal, but not stiff. Alina read each bullet point with the growing sense of detachment that came from having done this so many times that the outrage had burned itself out entirely, leaving behind only a kind of gray, ashen resignation. She glanced at the clock in the bottom right corner of her screen. 4:47 p.m. 13 minutes until the official end of the workday, though that designation meant nothing in practice. The workday ended when the work was done, and the work was never done. There was always another email, another revision, another fire that someone else had started, and that she was expected to extinguish with the quiet, unremarkable competence that had become her defining characteristic. Her phone buzzed on the desk. She looked down at it and felt a small, sharp pinch somewhere in her chest. It was a text from her mother. "Don't forget your father's birthday dinner tomorrow. He wants that pasta dish you make, the one with the sausage. Also, your sister says she might not be able to make it." Again, Alina set the phone face down without responding. She loved her parents. She did. She loved them in that complicated, tangled way that adult children love the people who raised them. A love shot through with gratitude and guilt and frustration, and a deep, abiding tenderness that was sometimes hard to access beneath the layers of expectation and obligation. Her father's birthday was important. She knew it was important, and yet, sitting here at 4:48 p.m. with Marcus's impossible revisions looming, and a headache that had been building since noon pressing against her temples like a vice. The prospect of cooking a complicated pasta dish for a family dinner felt like one demand too many in a life that had become an endless parade of demands. She picked up her phone again and typed, "I'll be there. I'll bring the pasta." Then she set the phone back down and opened Marcus's attached document. The commute home was 43 minutes on a good day, which this was not. The 5:15 train was packed to a density that violated several laws of physics, and Alina found herself pressed against the door with a man's elbow in her ribs and a woman's oversized tote bag wedged against her hip. She stared at the blurred darkness of the tunnel outside the window and tried to think about nothing. This was a technique she had been developing over the past several months. The art of thinking about nothing. It was harder than it sounded. The mind, she had discovered, did not want to be empty. It wanted to churn and worry and replay and anticipate. It wanted to catalog every perceived failure of the day, every unfinished task, every awkward interaction, every small humiliation. It wanted to mentally compose emails that would never be sent, rehearse arguments that would never happen, plan for contingencies that would likely never materialize. The mind was a machine designed for perpetual motion, and stopping it, even for a few minutes, required a kind of disciplined effort that felt almost athletic in its intensity. So she focused on her breathing. In through the nose for 4 counts. Hold for 4. Out through the mouth for 4. Hold for 4. She had read about this technique in an article she had found at 2 a.m. during one of her increasingly frequent bouts of insomnia. And while she was skeptical of anything that smelled of wellness culture or self-help industrial complex, she had to admit that the breathing thing sometimes worked. Sometimes, if she concentrated hard enough on the simple mechanics of air entering and leaving her body, she could create a small pocket of quiet in the center of the chaos. The train lurched around a curve, and the man with the elbow shifted, removing his appendage from her small mercies. Her phone buzzed again. This time it was an email notification, not from Marcus, but from her sister, Claire. Hey, sorry about tomorrow. Work thing came up. You know how it is. Can you tell Dad I'm sorry? Maybe I can come by next weekend instead. Alina read the email twice. She felt the familiar heat of irritation rise in her throat, and she swallowed it down. She knew exactly what work thing meant in Claire's vocabulary. It meant either a networking event that Claire didn't really want to attend, but felt she should, or a drinks invitation from someone in her social circle that Claire didn't want to decline. Claire's work things had a way of consistently coinciding with family obligations, and they had a way of being just important enough to seem legitimate, but just frivolous enough to feel like a slight. But Alina also knew that if she said anything about it, if she sent even a mildly pointed reply, it would escalate into a whole thing. There would be a passive-aggressive exchange that would stretch over days. Their mother would get involved. Their father would retreat into silence. And the birthday dinner would become a minefield of unspoken grievances. So Alina typed a brief, neutral reply. No problem. I'll let him know. Next weekend sounds good. She put her phone away and went back to counting her breaths. Her apartment was on the 4th floor of a building that had once been a factory of some kind. A textile mill, maybe, or a printing press. The developers had converted it into lofts in the early 2000s, and the result was a space that was both charming and deeply impractical. The ceilings were high, and the windows were large, which meant that in the summer the apartment turned into an oven, and in the winter it retained approximately none of the heat that the ancient radiator system struggled to produce. The exposed brick walls looked lovely in photographs, but were perpetually dusty, and the original hardwood floors creaked in a way that made stealthy midnight trips to the kitchen impossible. Alina loved it. She had lived here for 5 years, and despite its flaws, or perhaps because of them, it felt more like home than any place she had ever lived. It was hers. Every scratch on the floor, every water stain on the ceiling, every slightly crooked shelf she had installed herself was a mark of her presence, a physical record of her existence in this particular space. She dropped her bag on the floor just inside the door and kicked off her shoes without bothering to put them in the closet where they belonged. This was her first small act of rebellion against the order and compliance that her workday demanded. At the office, everything had its place. Every document was filed. Every email was categorized. Every task was tracked and measured and accounted for. Here, in the sanctuary of her apartment, she allowed herself to be just slightly messy. Shoes by the door, a coat draped over a chair instead of hung up, mail unopened on the kitchen counter. She stood in the middle of the living room for a moment, doing nothing, just standing, just breathing. The apartment was quiet in that particular way that city apartments are quiet, not truly silent, because there was always the distant sound of traffic, the muffled noise of a neighbor's television, the occasional siren threading through the night air, but quiet enough to hear herself think, which was both a blessing and a curse. She walked to the kitchen and filled the kettle. While she waited for it to boil, she stood at the window and looked out at the city. From the 4th floor, she could see the rooftops of the buildings across the street, their dark silhouettes cut against a sky that was never truly black, but always carried that orange-gray tinge of urban light pollution. A few windows were lit up, squares of warm yellow against the darkness, and she found herself wondering about the people behind those windows. Were they also standing in their kitchens, waiting for kettles to boil, trying to figure out how to calm down at the end of the day? Or were they the kind of people who came home and simply calmed down naturally, effortlessly, without having to work at it. The kettle screamed, and she poured the water over a tea bag chamomile, because she had read that chamomile was supposed to be calming, and she was willing to try anything at this point, even placebos. She carried the mug to the couch and sat down heavily, letting her head fall back against the cushions. The ceiling stared back at her, indifferent. She could see the water stain from last year's pipe incident, a vaguely anatomical shape that her friend Janet had once said looked like a map of Florida. She closed her eyes. Immediately, the day began to replay itself, not in a linear narrative fashion, but in fragments. Sharp, vivid fragments that flashed behind her eyelids like scenes from a film edited by someone with a cruel sense of juxtaposition. Marcus's email, the capital letters, the impossible contradictions, the meeting at 10 a.m. where she had presented the quarterly report and had been interrupted mid-sentence by David Chen, who had proceeded to explain her own findings back to her using different words, and received an approving nod from the vice president. The lunch she had skipped because she was too busy, which really meant she was too anxious to eat. Her stomach knotted into a fist that made the thought of food feel physically repellent. The moment at 2 p.m. when she had gone to the restroom and sat in the stall for 7 minutes, not doing anything, just sitting with her eyes open, staring at the metal partition door, because it was the only place in the entire building where she could be completely alone, and no one could ask her for anything. The text from her mother, the email from Claire, the train, the elbow, the breathing. She opened her eyes and took a sip of tea. It was too hot, and she burned her tongue, and the small pain was almost a relief because it was immediate and physical. and had nothing to do with emails or revisions or family expectations. It was just heat and tissue and nerve endings, simple and clean. She set the mug down on the coffee table on a coaster because some habits died hard, and picked up the book she had been trying to read for the past 3 weeks. It was a novel that Janet had recommended about a woman who walks across Spain on a pilgrimage route. Alina had read 47 pages so far, and she kept having to go back and reread sections because she would realize midway through a paragraph that her mind had wandered and she had absorbed nothing. She tried again now, finding her place with a finger and starting at the beginning of chapter 4. The protagonist had just arrived in a small village and was describing the church. Alina read the words, the stone walls, the bell tower, the smell of incense, and for a brief, flickering moment, she was there. She was in that Spanish village, walking on cobblestones, feeling the warmth of the sun on her face. It lasted maybe 10 seconds before the thought intruded. You should be checking your work email. What if Marcus sent something else? What if there's another revision? She set the book down. The problem, she understood with a clarity that was almost painful in its precision, was that she had lost the ability to transition. Somewhere along the way, and she couldn't pinpoint exactly when she had lost the capacity to move smoothly from one state of being to another. At work, she was in work mode, alert, focused, responsive, performing the role of competent professional with the dedication of a method actor who had forgotten she was acting. But when work ended, work mode didn't end. It followed her home like a shadow, attaching itself to her evenings and weekends, coloring her conversations and contaminating her rest. She would sit on her couch in her apartment, surrounded by her own things, and she would still be at the office, still checking, still bracing, still waiting for the next demand, the next crisis, the next thing that needed her attention. And the worst part heart that kept her up at night and made her chest tight during her 7-minute bathroom retreats was that she couldn't remember the last time she had truly, genuinely calmed down. Not the superficial calm of distraction, scrolling through her phone, watching television shows she didn't really care about, eating crackers over the sink, but real calm, deep calm, the kind of calm that she imagined other people experienced, the kind where your mind actually stops running and your body actually stops tensing, and you exist for a moment simply as a person in a place without agenda or anxiety. She didn't think she had ever been very good at calm. Even as a child, she had been a worrier. Her mother used to tell stories about how a leaner would lie awake at night, asking questions about death and infinity, and whether God could make a rock so heavy he couldn't lift it. But childhood worry had a different quality to it. It was philosophical, exploratory, driven by curiosity. Adult worry was none of those things. Adult worry was practical and grinding and endless. A conveyor belt of concerns that never stopped moving. And a leaner was standing at the end of it, trying to catch each item as it fell off, dropping some, fumbling others, never able to get ahead. She picked up her phone and, despite knowing it was a terrible idea, opened her work email. There were 3 new messages. One was a company-wide announcement about the upcoming wellness seminar, which felt like a particularly cruel irony. One was from a client thanking her for her help on a project, which was nice, but somehow failed to register emotionally. And the third was from Marcus, sent at 5:52 p.m., 7 minutes after the official end of the workday, with the subject line, "One more thing." She closed the email app without reading it. Then she opened it again and read it. Then she closed it again and put the phone on the kitchen counter, out of arm's reach from the couch, at 8:30 p.m., she realized she hadn't eaten dinner. She had been sitting on the couch for 2.5 hours, alternating between staring at the ceiling, attempting to read the Spain book, and engaging in a slow-motion internal debate about whether to look at Marcus's email again. She had accomplished nothing. She had relaxed nothing. She had simply existed in the most minimal sense of the word, like an appliance left plugged in, but not running. She went to the kitchen and opened the refrigerator. It was nearly empty. A carton of milk that was 1 day shy of its expiration date, half a jar of pasta sauce, some wilted arugula, a block of Parmesan with a dry edge, and a few eggs. The freezer had a bag of frozen peas and a bottle of vodka that she had bought 18 months ago for a party she had ended up not hosting. And that had remained frozen and untouched ever since, like a monument to a life she kept almost, but not quite living. She took out the eggs and the arugula and made herself a scrambled egg sandwich, which she ate standing at the counter. The eggs were slightly overcooked, and the bread was a bit stale. But she ate it anyway, chewing mechanically, tasting nothing. When she was done, she washed the pan and the plate and put them in the drying rack. And then she stood at the sink and looked out the window above it, which offered a view of the narrow alley between her building and the next one. In the alley, a cat was sitting on a dumpster lid, cleaning its paw with the focused concentration of a creature that had no concept of deadlines or revisions or family obligations. The cat was orange and white and slightly fat, and it performed its grooming ritual with an air of serene self-sufficiency that Alina found almost unbearably poignant. "I want to be that cat," she said out loud. The cat did not look up. She decided to take a shower. This was, she acknowledged, a somewhat unusual decision for 9 p.m. on a Tuesday. But she had read somewhere, possibly in the same 2 a.m. article that had taught her about box breathing, that the physical sensation of water could help to ground you in your body and pull you out of your head. She was willing to try anything. She had been trying anything for months. The meditation apps, the journaling, the essential oils that Janet had given her, and that she had dutifully placed on her nightstand, and that she occasionally remembered to open and sniff, and that smelled, as far as she could tell, exactly like nothing. The shower was hot, almost too hot, and she stood under the water with her eyes closed and let it hit the top of her head and run down her face and shoulders and back. For the first few minutes, her mind continued its usual chatter. Tomorrow's revisions, Dad's birthday, Claire's email, Marcus's one more thing, the milk that's about to expire. Did I send that confirmation to the client? What am I doing with my life? But gradually, slowly, the water began to do its work. Not the dramatic, cinematic work of a transformative moment, but something quieter, a gradual loosening, like a knot that was being slowly, carefully untangled. She became aware of her body, not in the anxious, monitoring way that she usually experienced it. Is my posture right? Am I clenching my jaw? Is that a new ache in my lower back? But in a more neutral, observational way. The feeling of water on skin, the warmth of it, the sound of it hitting the tile floor, the steam rising around her. She was, for a moment, simply a body in a shower, and that was enough. The moment passed, of course. They always did. But it was a moment, and she held onto it the way you hold onto a breath, not grasping, just nodding, just allowing it to be there before it went away. She got out of the shower, dried her hair, put on her pajamas, soft cotton pants, and an oversized t-shirt that she had stolen from a boyfriend 3 boyfriends ago, and that she kept not throwing away because it was the most comfortable garment she had ever owned, and went back the living room. The apartment felt different now, slightly softer somehow. The edges of things seemed less sharp. She wasn't sure if this was an actual change in her perception or just fatigue reframing her experience. But she decided not to interrogate it too closely. If the apartment wanted to feel softer, she would let it. She picked up the Spain book again, and for reasons she couldn't explain, it went better this time. She read an entire chapter without her mind wandering, or more accurately, her mind wandered, but it wandered within the world of the book rather than away from it. The protagonist walked through a forest and met an old man who gave her an orange, and Alina was there in the forest, accepting the orange, feeling the weight of it in her hand, the dimpled texture of the skin, the faint citrus smell. When she finished the chapter, she looked up and realized that an hour had passed. An entire hour gone, dissolved into the simple act of reading a story about a woman walking across a country she had never visited. It was, she realized with a start, the most relaxed she had felt in weeks, possibly months. She didn't want to examine it too closely. She was afraid that if she looked at the feeling directly, it would flinch and disappear like a deer in a clearing. So she just sat with it, the way the cat in the alley had sat with its paw, with quiet, unself-conscious attention. At 10:30, she made a decision. It was a small decision, the kind that wouldn't register on any external scale of significance, but it felt, to her, enormous. She decided to not set an alarm for the next morning. This was not something Alina Graves did. Alina Graves set an alarm every night, 2 alarms, actually. One for 6:15 and one for 6:30, because she didn't trust herself to wake up on time, and because the thought of oversleeping and being late to work filled her with a dread that was entirely out of proportion to the actual consequences. Eleanor Graves's mornings were choreographed down to the minute. Alarm, bathroom, shower, dress, breakfast. Always the same oatmeal with a banana, eaten standing at the counter while reviewing her schedule for the day, teeth, bag by the door, out by 7:45. Every day, no variation, no spontaneity, no room for error. But tonight, looking at her phone with its built-in alarm app staring up at her, she felt a sudden, fierce resistance to the whole apparatus, to the alarms and the schedules and the minute-by-minute planning that turned each morning into a performance that had to be executed flawlessly, or the whole day would be ruined. She was tired of it. She was tired of being tired of it. She was tired of being tired of being tired of it. She didn't set the alarm. The act of not doing something felt strangely powerful. It was a negative action, an absence, a void. But it was a void she had chosen, and that made it hers. She put the phone on the nightstand, not face down, not face up, just placed it there like a normal object, not a source of anxiety or a tool of obligation, and turned off the lamp. In the darkness, the apartment sounds rearranged themselves. The hum of the refrigerator, which she usually filtered out, became audible and almost rhythmic. The traffic outside, which she usually experienced as an undifferentiated wash of noise, separated into distinct sounds: a car passing, a distant horn, the idle of an engine at a stoplight. The building settled around her with small creaks and sighs, like an old house shifting in its sleep. She lay on her back and stared at the ceiling, which she couldn't see but knew was there. She thought about the orange in the book. She thought about the cat on the dumpster. She thought about the shower, the water, the steam. She thought about the scrambled egg sandwich, which she now realized she had actually kind of enjoyed in a humble, unremarkable way. She did not think about Marcus. She did not think about revisions. She did not think about her father's birthday, or her sister's absence, or her mother's text message. She did not think about the one more thing email that was sitting unread in her inbox, waiting for her like a trap. Well, she thought about all of those things. Of course she did. They surfaced and subsided like waves, and each time one appeared, she acknowledged it. Yes, that's there, I see it, and let it pass. She didn't fight the thoughts. She didn't try to push them away or replace them with better thoughts. She just let them come and go, like weather. She didn't know if this was meditation. She didn't know if it was mindfulness or acceptance, or just regular old lying in bed thinking about stuff. She didn't care about the label. The label was less important than the experience, and the experience was this. She was lying in bed, in her apartment, in her body, and she was not, at this particular moment, suffering. It was a low bar. She knew it was a low bar. Not suffering was not exactly the pinnacle of human experience, but it was where she was, and she had learned through months of failing to achieve anything higher that it was okay to start where you were. She turned on her side and pulled the blanket up to her chin. The pillow was cool against her cheek. The mattress supported her weight without complaint. Outside, the city continued its relentless activity. But here, in this room, on this bed, there was a small pocket of stillness that belonged to her and to no one else. She closed her eyes. She woke at 6:22 a.m., 8 minutes before her first alarm would have gone off. Her body, it seemed, had its own internal clock that was more reliable than any digital one, and it had betrayed her rebellion by waking her up on time anyway. She lay there for a moment, staring at the ceiling. This time she could see it. The water stain shaped like Florida. The slight crack in the plaster near the light fixture, and waited for the usual morning cascade of anxiety to begin. It didn't come. Not immediately, anyway. there was a moment, a genuine, unguarded moment, where she simply woke up. No alarm, no jolt, no immediate mental inventory of everything that needed to be done today. Just waking up the way a person wakes up, the way she imagined people who were not Alina Graves woke up every day. The anxiety came eventually, of course. It always did. By the time she was in the shower, it had begun its familiar murmur, the revisions, the dinner, the emails, the schedule. But it was quieter than usual, more distant, like a radio playing in another room. She could hear it if she listened, but she didn't have to listen. She could choose to let it be background noise. As she got dressed, she made oatmeal. She ate it standing at the counter, but this time she didn't look at her schedule while she ate. She just ate the oatmeal. It was oatmeal. It tasted like oatmeal. It was fine. She left the apartment at 7:48, 3 minutes later than usual. She walked to the train station instead of taking the bus, which added 10 minutes to her commute, but meant she could walk through the park, which she usually didn't do because it was out of the way. The park was small and not particularly beautiful. A rectangle of grass with a few trees, a bench, a dog run. But in the early morning light, with the sun just coming up over the buildings and casting long, golden shadows across the grass, it looked like something out of a painting. Not a great painting, not a masterpiece, but a nice one, a pleasant one, the kind of painting you would see in a dentist's office and think, huh, that's nice, and then forget about. She stopped on the path and watched a dog chase a ball. A golden retriever, young and enthusiastic, bounding across the grass with an energy that seemed almost aggressive in its joy. The dog's owner stood at the other end with a ball launcher, shooting the ball in long arcs, and the dog would sprint after it, snatch it up, and trot back with an expression of pure, uncomplicated delight. There was no irony in the dog's happiness, no self-consciousness, no awareness that this moment of joy was fleeting and would soon be replaced by another moment that might be less joyful. The dog was simply here, now, chasing a ball, and that was enough. Elena watched for 3 or 4 throws, and then she walked on. The train was less crowded at this hour, and she got a seat. She pulled out the Spain book and read another chapter. The protagonist had left the forest and was now walking through a field of sunflowers, and Elena was struck by a thought that was so simple it felt almost stupid. I could go to Spain. Not today, not tomorrow, not even this year probably, but she could go. It was an option. It was a thing that existed in the world as a possibility. She, Elena Graves, could buy a ticket and get on a plane and walk across Spain. The thought opened something in her chest, a small door that had been closed for so long she had forgotten it was there. Behind the door was not excitement exactly, but something adjacent to it, a sense of spaciousness, a reminder that the life she was living was not the only life available to her, that the rails she ran on were not actual rails, but habits, and habits could be changed. She didn't book a ticket to Spain. She closed the book as the train pulled into her station and put it in her bag and walked the 4 blocks to her office and went through security and rode the elevator to the 7th floor and sat down at her desk and turned on her computer and read Marcus's "One More Thing" email and began the work of addressing his revisions. But something was different, not dramatically different, not transform the narrative different, just slightly different, like the apartment the night before. The day felt a little softer around the edges. The fluorescent lights still buzzed. Brenda was still making her whispered phone calls. Tyler was still typing like his life depended on it. Marcus was still impossible. But Elena felt, for the first time in a long time, like she was observing all of this from a slight distance rather than being submerged in it. She was in the office, but not entirely of the office. She was doing the work, but not being consumed by it. She worked through the revisions methodically, making each change Marcus had requested, no matter how contradictory or absurd. She did not argue. She did not push back. She did not compose impassioned internal monologues about the futility of it all. She just did the work, the way the cat in the alley had cleaned its paw, with focused, unself-conscious attention, without drama, without commentary. At 11 a.m., she got up and went to the restroom. She did not sit in the stall for 7 minutes this time. She used the restroom, washed her hands, looked at herself in the mirror for a moment, really looked, not the quick, avoidant glance she usually gave her reflection, and went back to her desk. The woman in the mirror had looked tired. That was the main thing. Tired, but not broken. Tired, but not defeated. There were lines around her eyes that hadn't been there a few years ago, and a tension in her jaw that she could see even when she consciously tried to relax it. But there was also something else, something she couldn't quite name. A steadiness, maybe, or a clarity, like the water stain on her ceiling that she had stopped seeing as a flaw and started seeing as Florida. At lunchtime, she did something she almost never did. She left the office, not to run an errand or pick up a prescription or do any of the utilitarian tasks that usually constituted her midday exits. She left to eat lunch outside at a table like a person. She walked to a small cafe 2 blocks away, a place she had passed hundreds of times, but never entered because it was out of the way, and because eating lunch at her desk while working was more efficient, and because she didn't deserve to spend 30 minutes sitting at a cafe when there was work to be done. These were the reasons, or at least the reasons she had always given herself. But sitting here now, at a small round table by the window, with a cup of tomato soup and a piece of bread in front of her, she recognized them for what they were. Not reasons, but rationalizations. Excuses for denying herself the most basic kind of care. The cafe was warm and slightly noisy, filled with the clink of silverware and the murmur of conversation and the hiss of the espresso machine behind the counter. The walls were painted a deep green and decorated with framed prints of plants, ferns, monstera leaves, succulents, that gave the space a greenhouse feeling, as though you were eating inside a very small, very cozy botanic garden. Alina ate her soup slowly. She did not look at her phone. She did not think about Marcus or revisions or her father's birthday. She ate the soup. She tore the bread into pieces and dipped each piece into the soup and ate it. She tasted the soup, really tasted it, the way she had not tasted the scrambled egg sandwich the night before. It was good soup. Not great soup, not life-changing soup, but good, warm and savory, with a hint of basil, with a richness that suggested it had been made with actual tomatoes rather than the canned kind. When she finished, she sat for a moment with her empty bowl in front of her and looked out the window. The street was busy with the midday foot traffic of people who worked in the surrounding buildings, all of them walking with purpose, all of them going somewhere, all of them, she assumed, carrying their own versions of the weight she carried. She wondered how many of them had skipped lunch. She wondered how many of them were sitting in restroom stalls at this very moment, staring at partition doors, trying to find a few minutes of peace. She wondered how many of them had trouble calming down at the end of the day. The thought was not comforting exactly. There was no solace in the universality of suffering, but there was something in it, a recognition, perhaps, a reminder that the inability to calm down was not a personal failing, but a structural condition, a feature of a world that demanded constant activity and rewarded constant productivity, and pathologized the simple human need to stop. She picked up her bowl and took it to the counter and thanked the woman working there, who barely looked up and walked back to the office. The afternoon was long. Afternoons at Hartwell and Associates were always long. They had a quality of temporal distortion that made 1 p.m. feel closer to 5 p.m. and 4 p.m. feel like it existed in a separate, eternal dimension from which there was no escape. But Alina endured it with something that approached, if not peace, then at least a truce. She did the work. She answered the emails. She sat through a meeting where David Chen interrupted her 3 times, and she did not, as she might have done in the past, mentally compose a detailed fantasy about standing up and walking out. She just let him interrupt. It didn't matter. None of it mattered as much as she had always acted like it mattered. At 4:45 p.m., she began her end-of-day routine. She closed the documents she had been working on. She organized her desktop. She composed a reply to Marcus, attaching the revised file, keeping it brief and professional, not injecting any of the sarcasm or passive aggression that simmered beneath the surface of every interaction she had with him. She hit send. Then she did something she had never done before. She turned off her computer, not put it to sleep, not leave it on with the screen dimmed, ready to spring back to life at a keystroke. She turned it off. The screen went dark. The fan stopped whirring, and the machine that had been the center of her existence for the past 9 hours became just a box on a desk. She put on her coat. She picked up her bag. She said goodbye to Tyler, who looked surprised to see her leaving before 5 p.m., and to Brenda, who did not look up from her phone She walked to the elevator and rode it down and walked out of the building and into the late afternoon air, which was cool and smelled faintly of autumn leaves and exhaust, and that indefinable crispness that appeared in the air for a few weeks each year and then disappeared until next time. She stood on the sidewalk for a moment, just breathing. Not box breathing this time, not counted or measured or technique driven, just breathing in and out, the way the body does when you stop telling it how to do the thing it already knows how to do. The train was crowded again, but she didn't mind. She found a spot near the door where she could stand without being pressed against anyone, and she pulled out the Spain book and read. The protagonist had reached a city, Burgos. It was called, and was sitting in a cafe, drinking coffee, watching people. There was a passage that Alina read twice because it struck her with the force of something true. She sat and drank her coffee and watched the people go by, and she understood in that moment that calm was not something you found. It was not a destination at the end of a journey or a reward for hard work or a state you achieved through effort and discipline. It was what remained when you stopped doing all the things that were preventing it. It was the default state of a body and a mind that had been allowed to rest. It was always there, underneath the noise, waiting for the noise to stop. Alina closed the book and held it against her chest. The train rocked beneath her feet. Around her, people scrolled and stared and slept and existed in that particular state of suspended animation that public transit produces. The fluorescent lights of the car hummed, a different frequency than the office lights, but a hum nonetheless. She thought about the passage. She turned it over in her mind like a stone in her hand, feeling its weight, its texture, its edges. Was it true? Was calm really that simple? Was it really just a matter of stopping the doing, the checking, the bracing, the performing, and letting whatever was underneath come to the surface. It seemed too simple. It seemed like the kind of thing that people who had never actually experienced anxiety would say. But then again, Alina had to admit she had never actually tried it. Not really. She had tried techniques and strategies and methods, all of which were, in their own way, forms of doing. Even meditation, as she had practiced it, was a kind of work, a disciplined effort to achieve a particular state of mind, which was, when you thought about it, just another form of productivity, another item on the to-do list. Breathe mindfully for 10 minutes. Check. What if the thing to do was not to do anything? What if the path to calm was not a path at all, but a cessation of walking? The train arrived at her stop, and she stepped onto the platform and walked home through the park again. The sun was lower now, casting the grass and trees in a warm amber light that made everything look slightly idealized, like a memory rather than a present experience. The dog run was empty. The bench was occupied by an elderly man reading a newspaper with the slow, methodical attention of someone who had all the time in the world and knew it. She stopped at the bench, and on an impulse that she did not examine or question, sat down next to the man. Not next to him, exactly. There was a respectful distance between them, but on the same bench, the same wooden slats, the same view of the grass and the trees and the fatting sky. She sat there for 10 minutes. She didn't read. She didn't look at her phone. She didn't do anything. She sat on a bench in a park and watched the sky change color and listened to the birds and felt the air cool against her face and allowed herself for 10 uncomplicated minutes to be a person sitting on a bench. When she got up to walk home, she felt something she could only describe as lightness. Not the dramatic, euphoric lightness of a breakthrough moment in a movie, but a subtle, almost physical sense of weight reduction, as though she had been carrying a backpack full of rocks, and someone had removed a few of them without her noticing. At home, she did not immediately check her work email. This was becoming a pattern, she realized, or rather, an anti-pattern, a deliberate interruption of a pattern that had been running for years. She put her bag on the floor and her coat on the chair and her shoes by the door, and she stood in the middle of the living room, and she took 3 deep breaths, and then she went to the kitchen and began to cook. Not the pasta dish for her father's birthday. That would wait until tomorrow. Tonight, she cooked for herself. She opened the refrigerator and assessed its contents with a more generous eye than she had the night before. The milk was still 1 day from expiration, but that was fine. She could use it tonight. The arugula was wilted, but not beyond redemption. The parmesan was salvageable. She found a box of pasta in the cupboard and a can of tomatoes and a clove of garlic that was starting to sprout but was still usable, and she set to work. Cooking, she realized as she stood at the counter mincing garlic, was one of the few activities that reliably brought her into the present moment. Not because it was meditative or therapeutic or any of the other words that lifestyle articles liked to throw around, but because it required a specific kind of attention that left no room for anything else. If you were mincing garlic and thinking about Marcus's emails, you would cut your finger. If you were boiling pasta and mentally rehearsing a conversation with your mother, you would overcook it. Cooking demanded presence. It was a negotiation between intention and material, between what you wanted to happen and what the ingredients were willing to do. And it required you to be right here, right now, paying attention. She made a simple tomato sauce, garlic, tomatoes, salt, a pinch of sugar to cut the acidity. The wilted arugula stirred in at the end, so it wilted further, but didn't disintegrate. She cooked the pasta, drained it, tossed it with the sauce and a handful of grated Parmesan. She put it in a bowl and carried it to the couch and sat down and ate it. It was good, not restaurant good, not Instagram good, but good in the way that food you make for yourself, with your own hands, in your own kitchen, is good. It tasted like care, like the minimal, unglamorous act of taking care of yourself, which she had been so bad at for so long that even this, a bowl of pasta, eaten on the couch, no plate, no napkin, no presentation, felt like an act of rebellion. After she ate, she washed the dishes. She did not leave them in the sink. She washed them and put them in the drying rack and wiped down the counter, and felt, in the completion of these small tasks, a satisfaction that was entirely out of proportion to their significance. This was the paradox of calm, she thought. It lived in the smallest things. It was not found in grand gestures or dramatic changes, but in the cumulative effect of 100 tiny decisions to pay attention, to be present, to treat yourself with the same basic consideration you would extend to a guest. She made tea chamomile again, and this time she let it steep for the right amount of time instead of forgetting about it and coming back to find it oversteeped and bitter, and carried it to the couch and picked up the Spain book. The protagonist had left Burgos and was walking through a landscape that the author described as empty, in the way that only places that have been inhabited for centuries can be empty, full of the ghosts of all the people who had been there before. Their presence felt not as absence, but as a kind of invisible density, a weight of accumulated living that pressed against the present like a hand on a window pane. Alina read the sentence 3 times. It was not a sentence about calm exactly, but it was a sentence about presence, about the way places hold the imprint of the people who have been in them, and by extension, about the way the present moment holds the imprint of all the moments that came before it. She thought about her apartment, the scratches on the floor, the water stain, the creaking boards. All of it was a record of her being here in this place, living this life. All of it was evidence. She read for another hour. Then she put the book down and went to the window and looked out at the city. The same rooftops, the same orange-gray sky, the same squares of light in other people's windows. But tonight, she did not feel the distant loneliness that usually accompanied this view. Tonight, she felt connected to those lights. She felt like she was one of them, a small point of warmth in the darkness, a person in a room, doing the quiet, unremarkable work of being alive. She did not check her work email. She did not compose tomorrow's to-do list in her head. She did not mentally rehearse the conversation she would need to have with her mother about Claire's absence at the birthday dinner. She stood at the window, and then she closed the curtains, and then she went to the bathroom and brushed her teeth and washed her face and put on her pajamas, the same soft cotton pants, the same stolen t-shirt, and got into bed. She did not set an alarm. She lay on her back and stared at the ceiling and let the thoughts come and go, come and go. Marcus, Claire, the pasta dish, the milk, the book, the cat, the dog, the bench, the soup, the garlic, the shower, the water stain shaped like Florida, the protagonist walking through Spain, the invisible density of accumulated living. All of it was there. All of it was real. And all of it was okay. Not okay in the sense that everything was fine and nothing needed to change. Okay in the sense that it was what it was, and she was who she was, and that was enough for tonight. She turned on her side. The pillow was cool. The blanket was warm. The apartment settled around her with its small sounds, its familiar creaks and hums. She closed her eyes. The next morning, she woke at 6:19, 1 minute earlier than the day before. and lay in bed for 5 minutes before getting up. She did not check her phone. She did not think about work. She lay in bed and listened to the apartment wake up around her, the refrigerator humming to life, the pipes groaning as someone in the building turned on a shower, the first birds beginning their tentative, exploratory chirping outside the window. She got up and made oatmeal and ate it standing at the counter. And this time she did look at her schedule, because it was Thursday and there were things that needed to be done, and she was not, despite yesterday's small epiphanies, planning to abandon all responsibility. But she looked at the schedule differently. She saw the meetings and the tasks and the deadlines not as threats, but as information, data points on a map that she could navigate rather than obstacles to be feared. She walked to work through the park again. The golden retriever was there again, chasing the ball again, with the same unrestrained joy as the day before. The elderly man was on the bench again, reading his newspaper. Alina nodded to him as she passed, and he nodded back, and the exchange felt like a small, wordless acknowledgement of something they shared, an understanding that the park in the morning was a place where time moved differently, where the urgency of the day had not yet taken hold, where it was possible to simply be. Work was work. Marcus sent 4 emails before 10 a.m., each one more demanding and contradictory than the last. David Chen interrupted her in a meeting and took credit for an idea she had presented in a previous meeting, and the vice president nodded approvingly, and Alina did not explode or implode or even mentally compose an elaborate revenge fantasy. She noticed the injustice, acknowledged it. Yes, that happened. It was unfair. It felt bad, and let it go. Not because it didn't matter, but because carrying it around like a stone in her pocket would not change anything, and would only make the day heavier. At lunch, she went back to the cafe with the green walls and the plant prints. She ordered soup again, butternut squash this time, and a piece of bread, and she ate slowly and tasted the food and looked out the window at the street and let herself be present in the way that cooking had taught her to be present, not as a technique, but as a natural consequence of paying attention to what was right in front of her. The afternoon was long again, because afternoons were always long, but she moved through it with a steadiness that surprised her. She was not calm in the way she had imagined calm to be, a state of perfect serenity, untouched by the chaos of the external world. She was calm in a more ordinary, more sustainable way. She was calm the way a river is calm, not still, not motionless, but moving with a kind of contained momentum. Turbulence beneath the surface, but a smooth, steady flow on top. At 4:45, she closed her documents and organized her desktop and turned off her computer and put on her coat and picked up her bag and left. On the train, she read the Spain book. The protagonist had reached the Meseta, a vast, flat plateau that the author described as the place where pilgrims either quit or break through to something deeper. Elena read about the Meseta with a recognition that was almost uncomfortable in its precision. The Meseta was the middle of things, the place where the novelty had worn off and the end was not yet in sight, the place where the mind, deprived of new stimuli, turned on itself and began to ask questions that were easier to avoid when there were new things to look at. The protagonist struggled on the Meseta. She walked for days through a landscape that was featureless and monotonous, and she wanted to quit, and she didn't quit, and the reason she didn't quit was not because she was brave or strong or inspired, but because she had made a decision to keep walking, and she kept making that decision, one step at a time, and eventually the Meseta ended and the landscape changed, and she was still walking. Elena closed the book and looked out the window of the train. tunnel walls were gray and featureless, the meseta of public transit, and she thought, I am on the meseta. I have been on the meseta for years, but I am still walking. That evening, she cooked the pasta dish for her father's birthday. She went to the grocery store on the way home and bought the ingredients she needed: Italian sausage, bell peppers, onions, a fresh block of Parmesan, a box of rigatoni, a bunch of basil that was fragrant and green and alive in a way that made her think of the plant prints in the cafe. She carried the bags home and set them on the counter and began to cook. This was a more involved dish than the previous night's simple tomato sauce. It required browning the sausage, sautéing the vegetables, building layers of flavor, simmering the sauce for a longer time. It required attention and patience, and a willingness to stand at the stove for an hour, doing nothing else, being nowhere else. She found, to her surprise, that she enjoyed it. Not in a performative, Instagram-ready way. She was not going to photograph the pasta or post about it, or tell anyone about the experience. She just enjoyed the act of cooking. The sizzle of the sausage in the pan, the smell of the onions as they softened and turned translucent, the way the sauce changed color and texture as it simmered, deepening from bright red to a rich, dark burgundy, the sound of the water boiling, the pasta tumbling in the pot like clothes in a washing machine. All of it was sensory and immediate and present, and all of it was, in its own unassuming way, a form of calm. While the sauce simmered, she set the table. She used the good dishes, the ones she kept in the cabinet above the stove, wrapped in newspaper, that she had bought on impulse 2 years ago and had used exactly once. She put out cloth napkins and real forks and a bottle of wine that she had been saving for an occasion that never seemed to arrive. The occasion, she decided, was now. The occasion was a Thursday night dinner for her father's 67th birthday, and it deserved good dishes and cloth napkins and wine. She made a salad, just arugula and lemon dressing and shaved parmesan, because she was out of other greens, and because simple was fine. And she sliced some bread and put it in a basket, and she looked around her apartment and saw, with a clarity that surprised her, how nice it looked. Not nice in a magazine way. Nice in a lived-in, cared-for human way. The warm light of the kitchen, the steam rising from the pot, the table set with dishes that had been waiting patiently in their newspaper wrapping for someone to decide they were worth using. Her parents arrived at 7. Her mother came in first, already talking, already listing the things that needed to be discussed. Claire's absence, the parking situation, the fact that the building's elevator was out again, and her father followed behind her, quieter, with the slightly dazed expression of a man who had learned, over 40 years of marriage, to let his wife's words wash over him like weather. But when her father saw the table, the good dishes, the cloth napkins, the wine, he stopped. He looked at it for a moment, and then he looked at Alina, and something passed between them that did not require words. It was a look of recognition, of appreciation, of the particular tenderness that passes between a parent and a child when the child does something unexpected and kind. "Alina," he said, "this is beautiful. It's just dinner, Dad. It's not just dinner." He put his hand on her shoulder and squeezed, and she felt, beneath his palm, a warmth that went deeper than skin and muscle and bone. They sat down and ate. The pasta was good, really good, possibly the best she had ever made it. The sauce rich and complex and deeply flavored from the long simmer. The salad was bright and sharp. The bread was crusty and soft. The wine was red and smooth and went with everything. her mother talked. Claire's work thing. It turned out to be a gallery opening for a friend of a friend, which confirmed Aline's suspicion, but which she did not comment on. The parking situation. Her mother had circled the block 3 times before finding a spot. The elevator, the building manager said it would be fixed by Friday. But he had said that last Friday too. All of it was delivered in the rapid, slightly anxious stream of consciousness that was her mother's primary mode of communication. And Aline listened without trying to fix anything, without offering solutions or reassurances, just listening the way she had sat on the bench in the park, present, attentive, without agenda. Her father was quieter than usual, which Aline attributed to the wine and the lateness of the hour. He ate his pasta slowly, with the focused appreciation of a man who took food seriously. And when he finished his first plate, he held it out for more without asking. And Aline served him with a feeling that was close to joy. After dinner, they moved to the couch, her mother in the armchair, her father on the couch beside Aline. And Aline brought out the cake she had picked up from the bakery on the corner. It was a small chocolate cake with "Happy Birthday, Dad" written on it in slightly wobbly icing. And when she lit the candles, 67 of them, or as close as she could get with the candles she had, her father laughed. A real laugh. The kind she hadn't heard from him in a long time. 67 candles, he said. You're going to set off the smoke detector. That's the plan, Aline said. A dramatic exit. He blew out the candles. It took 2 tries, and they ate the cake. And her mother told the story of the day he was born, which she told every year, and which Aline could have recited from memory, but which she listened to as though hearing it for the first time, because her mother told it with a warmth and a vividness that made it feel new, and because her father listened to it with a small, private smile that suggested he liked hearing it. Even after 67 years, at Her mother stood up and said they should go, and her father nodded but didn't move right away. He turned to Alina and said quietly, so her mother wouldn't hear, "Thank you for this. I know it wasn't easy with everything you have going on." Alina opened her mouth to say the thing she always said. It was nothing. It's no big deal. Don't be silly. And then she closed it. She let the thank you land. She let it be true. "You're welcome, Dad," she said. "I wanted to do it." He nodded again, and this time he stood, and she walked them to the door, and her mother kissed her on the cheek and said, "You're too thin," and her father hugged her, really hugged her, not the perfunctory half embrace he usually deployed, but a full, two-armed, lingering hug that lasted several seconds longer than expected. And she hugged him back and felt, in that embrace, something she had been reaching for without knowing it. A moment of complete, uncomplicated presence. They left. The door closed behind them. The apartment was quiet again. Alina stood in the doorway for a moment, looking at the table, still set with the good dishes, still bearing the traces of the meal, sauce stains on the plates, crumbs on the tablecloth, candle wax dripped onto the cake board. The mess should have bothered her. It would have bothered her yesterday, or last week, or last month. But tonight, it just looked like evidence of a good evening. Like the scratches on the floor and the water stain on the ceiling. Like the invisible density of accumulated living. She did not clean up right away. She left the dishes on the table and went to the couch and sat down and picked up the Spain book. The protagonist had reached Leon, a city with a cathedral that the author described in language so reverent it bordered on the religious. Alina read about the stained glass windows and the carved stone and the light that filtered through in kaleidoscopic patterns. And she thought about the good dishes on her table and the candles on the cake and the way her father had laughed. And she understood, in a way she hadn't before, that beauty was not something you found in extraordinary places. It was something you created in ordinary ones through the simple act of paying attention. The days that followed were not dramatically different. This was important to note because the narrative of self-improvement, the story that Aliner's mind kept wanting to tell, was one of dramatic transformation. She wanted the story to have a shape before and after, struggle and victory, anxiety and calm. But life, she was learning, did not conform to narrative structures. Life was messier than that, more recursive, more overlapping. So the days that followed were not dramatically different, but they were incrementally different in ways that were sometimes too subtle to notice in the moment, but that accumulated over time like the scratches on her floor. She kept walking through the park in the morning. She kept going to the cafe at lunch. She kept reading the Spain book. She kept cooking dinner instead of eating crackers over the sink or skipping meals entirely. She kept not checking her work email after she left the office. She kept not setting an alarm. None of these changes were permanent. She knew that. She had been around herself long enough to know that habits were not installed once and then maintained without effort. They were daily choices made fresh each morning, and some days the choice was easier than others. On Monday, Marcus sent an email at 6 p.m. with the subject line, "Final version, actually final." And she opened it and read it and felt the familiar knot of tension in her chest. And for a moment, a long, dark moment, she was back in the old pattern, back in the meseta of anxiety, back in the stall of the restroom, staring at the partition door. But the moment passed. It came and it went like a wave, and she was still standing. On Wednesday, Claire called her, actually called her voice instead of email, and said she was sorry about missing the dinner, and that she knew she did this a lot, and that she wanted to do better. Aliner listened and said you for saying that, and did not say the other things she wanted to say, the sharp, accumulated things that had been building for years, because she understood in that moment that saying them would not make her feel better. It would only start the machine running again. And she was tired of the machine. On Friday, she finished the Spain book. The protagonist reached Santiago de Compostela, the end of the pilgrimage, and the author described the arrival in language that was quiet and understated and deeply moving. There was no dramatic revelation, no blinding light, no angels. The protagonist walked into the cathedral and sat down and cried, not because she had arrived, but because she had walked, and the walking had changed her in ways she couldn't articulate. And the crying was not sad, but overwhelming. A release of everything she had been carrying without knowing she was carrying it. Alina closed the book and sat on her couch and felt tears on her own cheeks. She was not a person who cried easily, and she was slightly embarrassed by the tears, even though no one was there to see them. But she let them come. She did not wipe them away or pretend they weren't there or analyze them for psychological significance. She just sat and cried quietly for no reason and for every reason. And when the tears stopped, she felt not calm, not peaceful, not transformed, but empty, in a good way. In the way that a cup is empty so that it can be filled. She put the book on the coffee table and looked at it. The cover was slightly creased from being carried in her bag, and the pages were soft from being handled. And there was a small stain on the edge from the time she had read it while eating soup at the cafe, and a drop had landed on the page. The book was no longer new. It was used. It was lived in. It had been a companion on her own small, daily pilgrimage, and it bore the marks of that journey. She picked up her phone, and for the first time in she didn't know how long, opened her browser instead of her email. She typed 4 words into the search bar. flights to Spain September. The results appeared, and she looked at them with the same quiet, observational attention she had been cultivating. Numbers and times and cities: Madrid, Barcelona, Santiago, options, possibilities, doors that were not closed. She did not book a flight, not yet, but she saved the search, and the act of saving it, of putting it in a folder on her phone where she could find it later, where it would wait for her, patient and undemanding, felt like a promise. Not a dramatic promise, not a life-altering vow, but a small, quiet promise to herself. You are allowed to want things. You are allowed to imagine a life that is different from the one you are living. You are allowed to walk towards something just because you want to walk toward it. Saturday was a gray day, the kind of late autumn day where the sky was one continuous sheet of cloud, and the light was flat and diffuse, and the city looked like a photograph that had been left in the sun too long. Eleanor woke at 7, no alarm. Just the natural waking of a body that had begun slowly to trust itself again, and lay in bed for a while, watching the gray light filter through the curtains. She got up and made coffee instead of tea, because it was Saturday, and Saturday was different from weekdays and coffee on a Saturday morning, was one of the small, specific pleasures that she had denied herself for years, because caffeine made her anxious, and anxious was bad, and bad was to be avoided. But today she wanted coffee, so she made coffee, and she drank it on the couch with the Spain book, finished now. But she kept it nearby, like a talisman. And she looked out the window at the gray sky, and felt something she could only describe as contentment, not happiness. Happiness was too big a word, too loaded with expectations and associations. Contentment was quieter, more sustainable, more honest. It was the feeling of having enough, not too little, not too much. Enough. She spent the morning cleaning the apartment, not the frenetic, anxious cleaning that she sometimes engaged in when she was trying to exert control over her environment, but a slower, more intentional version. She dusted the exposed brick. She scrubbed the water stain on the ceiling with a solution she found online, and it faded slightly, but didn't disappear entirely. And she decided that was fine. Some stains, she thought, are not meant to be removed. Some stains are meant to be lived with, accommodated, accepted as part of the landscape. She organized the bookshelf, pulling out books she would never read and setting them aside to donate. She found, wedged between a cookbook she had never used and a self-help book she had read and immediately regretted, a photograph she had forgotten about. It was a picture of her and Claire, taken at the beach when they were teenagers. Claire was making a silly face, mid-laugh, and Alina was looking at her with an expression of fond exasperation that was so familiar it made her chest ache. They had been close once, not in the dramatic, movie sister way, but in the ordinary, daily way of sisters who shared a bathroom and borrowed each other's clothes and knew each other's secrets. When had they stopped being that? When had the distance between them opened up? And why hadn't either of them tried to close it? She put the photograph on the bookshelf, propped against a row of novels where she could see it. She did not call Claire. She did not send an email. She just put the photograph where she could see it and let it be a reminder not of what was lost, but of what had existed and might, with enough patience and effort, exist again. In the afternoon, she went for a walk, not to the park, not to the grocery store, not with any destination in mind. She just walked. She walked down her street and turned right and then left and then right again, wandering through neighborhoods she had passed 1,000 times but never really looked at. She saw a house with a garden full of ceramic frogs. She saw a laundromat with a neon sign that was missing the L so it read Aundry, and she thought this was funnier than it probably was. She saw a child on a scooter, helmet on backward, being chased by a laughing woman who was probably his mother. And she stopped and watched them until they turned a corner and disappeared. She walked for an hour, and when she came home, her legs were tired and her face was cold, and she felt in her body the pleasant exhaustion of purposeless movement. She had not accomplished anything. She had not been productive. She had simply moved through the world, and the world had been there, and that was enough. Sunday was her father's actual birthday. The dinner had been Thursday because that was more convenient for everyone. And she called him in the afternoon to wish him a happy birthday again. They talked for 20 minutes, which was long for them. He told her about a bird he had seen in the yard that morning, a bird he couldn't identify, and he described it in such precise and loving detail. The color of its breast, the shape of its beak, the way it hopped along the branch, that Eleanor felt a lump form in her throat. Her father, she realized, was someone who paid attention. He had always paid attention to birds, to weather, to the small, specific details of the physical world that most people walked past without noticing. He had never been a calm person exactly. He had his own anxieties, his own worries, his own versions of the machine. But he had this, the ability to look at a bird and really see it, to hold the image in his mind with such care and precision that he could transmit it over the phone to his daughter, who could almost see it too. Maybe it was a warbler, Eleanor said. Maybe, he said. I'll look it up. After she hung up, she sat on the couch and thought about attention, about what it meant to pay attention, to really pay attention, the way her father paid attention to birds, and the way the cat in the alley paid attention to its paw, and the way she had paid attention to the soup and the pasta and the gray sky. attention she was beginning to understand was not a cognitive function, but a relational act. It was the act of connecting with something outside yourself, of saying, through the simple investment of your time and focus, you exist, and I see that you exist, and that matters. This was the opposite of what her work demanded. At work, attention was a commodity, a resource to be allocated efficiently, optimized for maximum output, measured and tracked and accounted for. But the attention she was talking about, the attention her father gave to birds, the attention she gave to the soup, was not a commodity. It was a gift. You gave it freely, without expectation of return. And in the giving, you received something that could not be quantified or optimized. The experience of being present, fully and without reservation, in a moment that would not come again. Sunday evening, she cooked again. Not a specific dish for a specific occasion, just dinner for herself on a Sunday night, the last evening before the week began again. She made a risotto, which she had never attempted before, and which required, as she quickly discovered, a level of attention and patience that bordered on the meditative. You had to stir constantly. You had to add the broth a little at a time. You had to watch the rice and adjust the heat and pay attention to the texture and the consistency. And if you stopped paying attention for even a few minutes, the risotto would rebel. It would stick to the pan, or become gummy, or seize up in some way that could not be undone. She stirred. She added broth. She stirred some more. She stood at the stove for 45 minutes, doing nothing else, being nowhere else, and the risotto came together slowly, gradually, transforming from separate, unremarkable ingredients into something cohesive and creamy and deeply satisfying. When it was done, she ate it at the table, not on the couch, at the table, on one of the good dishes, with a cloth napkin and a glass of wine. And she tasted it and it was good. Really good. Possibly the best thing she had ever cooked. And she thought, this is what calm tastes like. Not the absence of flavor, but the presence of it. Not nothing, but something. Not empty, but full. She went to bed at 10:30, as she had been doing more or less for the past week. She did not set an alarm. She lay on her back and stared at the ceiling and let the thoughts come and go, come and go. The week ahead, the meetings, the emails, the deadlines, the demands, the flight to Spain, saved in a folder on her phone, waiting. The photograph of Claire on the bookshelf. The bird her father had seen. The cat on the dumpster. The golden retriever chasing the ball. The old man on the bench. The cafe with the green walls. The soup, the pasta, the risotto, the good dishes, the cloth napkins, the wine, the tears, the walk through the gray city, the ceramic frogs, the backward helmet, the Spain book, finished and creased and stained, the water stain on the ceiling, faded but not gone, the scratches on the floor, the creaking boards, the hum of the refrigerator, the sound of the city, never silent, never still, but somehow tonight almost gentle. She thought about the passage from the book, the one about calm being what remains when you stop preventing it. She had been thinking about that passage for days, turning it over in her mind, testing it against her experience, and she had come to a conclusion. The passage was right, but it was also incomplete. Calm was not just the absence of prevention. It was the presence of permission. It was what happened when you gave yourself permission to stop, to rest, to be, without guilt or anxiety, or the constant, corrosive sense that you should be doing something else, something more, something better. She had not cured her anxiety. She had not solved her problems. She had not transformed her life. Marcus was still impossible. Claire was still absent. Her mother still worried. Her father still saw birds that he couldn't identify. The work was still there, waiting for her on Monday morning, and it would still be there on Tuesday and Wednesday and Thursday and Friday. An endless conveyor belt of demands that would never stop moving. But underneath all of it, underneath the emails and the revisions and the family obligations and the internal machinery of worry and performance and self-surveillance, there was something quiet and steady and persistent, something that had always been there, like the hum of the refrigerator or the creak of the floorboards, but that she had been too busy, too anxious, too focused on preventing it to notice. Calm, not the dramatic, cinematic calm of a life transformed, not the permanent, unshakable calm of enlightenment, just calm, ordinary, daily, imperfect calm, the calm that comes at the end of the day when you have done what you could do and you let the rest go. The calm that lives in a bowl of soup, a walk through the park, a book about Spain, a phone call with your father, a pasta dish made with love, a risotto stirred for 45 minutes, a moment on a bench watching the sky change color, the calm that says, you are here, you are alive, this is enough. She turned on her side and pulled the blanket up and closed her eyes. Outside, the city hummed its eternal hum. Inside, the apartment settled into its familiar creaks and sighs. And Alina, for the first time in longer than she could remember, let herself drift to sleep without fighting it, without analyzing it, without turning it into one more thing she needed to do correctly. She just slept, and the calm, patient, and undemanding waited for her in the morning. She woke to the sound of rain, not the gentle, atmospheric rain of films and novels, but the ordinary, unremarkable rain of a Monday morning in late autumn. A steady, gray drizzle that blurred the windows and made the city look like a watercolor left out in the weather. The light that filtered through the curtains was thin and pale, the color of old paper, and it gave the apartment a muted, hushed quality, as though the world outside had wrapped itself in a blanket and decided to stay in bed. Alina lay still for a moment, listening. The rain made a different kind of silence than the usual morning silence. It filled the space between sounds rather than leaving it empty. A white noise that was almost soothing in its constancy. She could hear it tapping against the window glass, a gentle, irregular percussion, and beneath it the deeper, more constant sound of it hitting the rooftop and running through the gutters. She thought about her father's bird, the one he couldn't identify, and wondered if birds minded the rain. She imagined them huddled under leaves, feathers ruffled, waiting it out, and the image gave her a feeling she couldn't quite name. Something between tenderness and recognition. 6:18 a.m. The internal clock, still reliable, still betraying her rebellion by waking her on time even when no alarm demanded it. But she didn't mind this morning. The rain made the waking gentler, as though she were being surfaced from sleep rather than yanked out of it. She got up and went to the window and pulled back the curtain. The street below was wet and shining, the pavement reflecting the headlights of the early cars in long, smeared streaks of amber and white. A woman with an umbrella walked past, moving quickly, head down, navigating the puddles with the practiced efficiency of someone who had done this many times before. A man in a hooded jacket stood at the corner waiting for the light to change, shoulders hunched, hands in pockets, looking at nothing in particular. The world was going about its business, rain or no rain. And there was something in that, in the simple, unremarkable fact of continuation, that Alina found steadying. She made coffee, not because it was Saturday, but because she wanted to. The ritual of it, the scoop of grounds, the sound of the water, the smell that filled the kitchen and reached into the living room like an invisible hand, had become something she looked forward to, a small pleasure that she no longer had to justify or qualify or feel guilty about. She poured the coffee into a mug, not the good mug, just a regular mug, because it was Monday and the good dishes were for occasions, and Monday was not an occasion. Monday was just Monday, and she carried it to the window and stood there and drank it while the rain fell and the city moved and the morning slowly, incrementally brightened. She did not think about work. This was a victory, albeit a small and fragile one. The Monday morning work thoughts were the most persistent of all the work thoughts. They arrived early, before she was fully awake, and they planted themselves in her mind with a tenacity that made them difficult to dislodge. But this morning, standing at the window with her coffee and the rain, she noticed them arrive. She could see them coming, like the woman with the umbrella in the street below, approaching from a distance. And she let them pass without inviting them in. They walked past her mental front door and kept going, and she was still standing at the window, drinking coffee, watching the rain. The train was more crowded than usual, because rain always made people take the train instead of walking or biking, and the platform had been a sea of wet umbrellas and damp coats. Eleanor found a spot near the middle of the car, wedged between a man with a large backpack and a woman holding a child who was watching a cartoon on a tablet with the glazed, hypnotic focus of total absorption. She looked at the child's face, round, smooth, unlined, illuminated by the blue-white glow of the screen, and felt a pang of something that might have been envy. Not for childhood exactly, but for the ability to be completely, effortlessly absorbed in something. To give your full attention to a cartoon about talking animals without any awareness that you were giving your full attention to it. To simply watch without monitoring yourself watching. She pulled out the Spain book, even though she had finished it, and opened it to a random page. She didn't read the words, She just held it, the way you might hold a photograph of a place you had been and wanted to remember. The book had become a kind of object of meditation for her, not because of its contents, but because of what it represented. The week when something had shifted, however slightly, however impermanently. She could open it to any page and feel the echo of that week. The cafe, the park, the bench, the soup, the walk through the gray city, and the echo was enough. The train arrived at her stop, and she stepped onto the platform and walked through the rain to the office. She did not have an umbrella. She had forgotten to check the forecast and had left the apartment without one. And now she was getting wet, her hair darkening with moisture, the shoulders of her coat spotting with rain. She could have been annoyed about this. She would have been annoyed about this a week ago. One more thing going wrong. One more small frustration to add to the accumulating pile. But this morning, walking through the rain without an umbrella, she felt something different. She felt the water on her skin. She felt the coolness of it, the lightness of each drop, the way it touched her face and her hands and the back of her neck. She felt, in a word, alive. Not in a dramatic or euphoric way, but in the most basic physical sense. She was a body moving through weather, and the weather was touching her, and she was aware of it. She walked into the office with damp hair and a slightly damp coat, and sat down at her desk and turned on her computer and began the work of being a leaner Graves professional. But the rain stayed with her for a while, like a memory of something she couldn't quite name, and it made the day feel different, softer, less enclosed. Marcus was in rare form on Monday. He had spent the weekend, or so he claimed, rethinking the entire approach to the project, which meant that the revisions Alina had completed on Friday were now obsolete, replaced by a new set of directives that bore almost no resemblance to anything that had come before. He presented these new directives in a meeting at 9, 4:30 a.m. with the energy of a man who believed he was having a creative breakthrough, packing in front of the conference room whiteboard, marker in hand, drawing arrows and boxes and diagrams that connected nothing to nothing in a way that was almost impressive in its arbitrariness. So the through line here, he said, drawing a long arrow from one box to another, is integration. Everything needs to be integrated. The data, the narrative, the visuals, it all needs to feel like one thing, not separate things. Alina raised her hand. Marcus, can you clarify what you mean by integrated in this context? Because the last version had a very clear separation between the data section and the narrative section, which was what you asked for. Marcus looked at her with the expression of a teacher who had been interrupted by a student asking a question that, while technically valid, missed the point of the lesson. It needs to feel integrated, Alina, not be integrated. Feel integrated. Okay, she said. And how do you want me to achieve that feeling while maintaining the separation you asked for? I don't know. That's your job. He turned back to the whiteboard and drew another arrow. Alina did not explode. She did not implode. She did not mentally compose a resignation letter or a scathing email or a detailed fantasy about walking out of the meeting and never coming back. She sat in her chair and she breathed in through the nose, out through the mouth. No counting, no technique, just breathing. And she watched Marcus draw his arrows and boxes, and she thought, this man is drawing arrows on a whiteboard, and he believes it means something, and it does not mean anything, and that is okay. That is just what Monday mornings are. The thought was not cynical. It was not bitter or dismissive or superior. It was simply an observation delivered with the same neutral clarity she had been cultivating for the past week. Marcus was drawing arrows. The arrows did not mean anything. The meeting would end, everyone would go back to their desks and do their best to interpret the arrows into actionable tasks, and the result would be whatever it would be, and none of it was worth the amount of anxiety she had historically invested in it. She left the meeting at 10:45 with a page of notes that she knew would be largely useless, and a feeling of calm that she recognized by now as the real thing, not the absence of frustration. She was frustrated, genuinely frustrated, because the arrows were nonsense, and everyone in the room knew they were nonsense. But the presence of something larger than the frustration, a container big enough to hold the frustration without being overwhelmed by it. At her desk, she opened a new document and began to work. She did not try to implement Marcus's arrows. She did not try to make the report feel integrated while maintaining the separation he had previously demanded. She did what she always did, which was to write the best version of the report she could write, using her professional judgment and her years of experience and her understanding of what the client actually needed, which was, as it turned out, not arrows on a whiteboard, but clear information presented in a readable format. As she worked through the morning, and at 12:30 she saved the document, closed her computer, and went to lunch. The cafe was busier than usual, probably because of the rain. People seeking refuge, seeking warmth, seeking a place to sit that was not their desk. Alina had to wait 5 minutes for a table, which she would normally have experienced as an annoyance, but which she experienced today as simply waiting. 5 minutes of standing in a warm cafe, smelling coffee and bread and soup, watching other people wait, feeling the residual dampness of the rain drying on her coat. 5 minutes of being in a place without being anywhere in particular. She got a table by the window, not the same table as before, but a similar one, small and round, with a view of the wet street. And she ordered the soup of the day, which was lentil, and a piece of the bread, which was the same bread as before, crusty and soft. And she ate slowly and looked out the window. The rain had not stopped. It had settled into that particular rhythm that autumn rain sometimes finds. Not a downpour, but not a drizzle either. A steady, medium fall that made the streets shine and the gutters run, and the pedestrians move with that particular hunched, purposeful gait that rain produces. She watched a man step off the curb into a puddle that was deeper than he expected, and she saw the moment of surprise on his face, the brief flash of "oh no," followed immediately by resignation, and she felt a flicker of sympathy that was also, somehow, affection. She didn't know this man. She would never know this man. But for a second, standing at the window of a cafe on a rainy Monday, she had seen something real in his face, something unguarded and human, and she had recognized it because it was something she had felt herself many times in many puddles, both literal and metaphorical. The lentil soup was good, earthy and thick, with a depth of flavor that suggested it had been simmering for a long time, and she ate it with the same attention she had brought to the tomato soup and the butternut squash soup and the pasta and the risotto. And she thought, this is the practice, not the meditation apps or the breathing techniques or the essential oils that smell like nothing. This, eating soup, looking out the window, paying attention to what is right in front of you, because it is right in front of you, and because you have chosen to be here, now, doing this one small thing. She finished the soup and the bread, and she sat for another few minutes, watching the rain, and then she paid and walked back to the office. The afternoon brought a new development. At 2:15, an email arrived from Patricia Holloway, the vice president of the division, with the subject line, "Quick conversation." The body of the email was 2 sentences. Are you free for a few minutes this afternoon? I'd like to discuss something with you. Alina stared at the email. Her heart rate, which had been steady all day, ticked up by a measurable amount. Emails from Patricia Holloway were never good. Patricia was the kind of executive who communicated primarily through delegation and deflection. She asked for conversations when she wanted to assign more work, when she wanted to deliver criticism indirectly, or when she wanted to gather information without revealing why she needed it. A quick conversation with Patricia was never quick and was rarely about what it appeared to be about. Alina's mind immediately began constructing scenarios. She was being reassigned. She was being demoted. She was being asked to take on Marcus's role, which would mean managing the impossible arrows and the contradictory revisions and the meetings that could have been emails. She was being fired. She was being praised, which was somehow worse, because praise from Patricia always came with strings attached, a kind of advance payment on future obligations. She caught herself. She saw the scenarios proliferating, dark mushrooms springing up in the damp soil of her anxiety, and she recognized them for what they were, not predictions, but projections, not information, but fiction. She did not know what Patricia wanted to discuss. She could not know. The email contained no clues, no hints, no data points that could be used to construct a reliable forecast. The only thing she could know with any certainty was that she was sitting at her desk, looking at an email, and that her heart was beating faster than it needed to. She took a breath, then another. Then she typed a reply. I'm free at 3:30 if that works for you. Patricia responded in 30 seconds. She must have been watching her inbox, which was either efficient or ominous or both, with a single word: perfect. Alina closed the email and went back to work. She did not allow herself to think about the meeting. This was not easy. The meeting sat in her mind like a stone in a shoe, an unignorable presence that demanded attention. Every few minutes, it would resurface. What does she want? What does she want? What does she want? And each time, she would acknowledge it. I don't know. And I won't know until 3:30. And redirect her attention to the document in front of her. This was the hardest part of the practice. She was discovering not the sitting on benches, or the eating of soup, or the walking through parks. Those were pleasurable, and it was easy to be present when the present was pleasant. The hard part was being present when the present was uncomfortable, when anxiety was knocking at the door, and every impulse she had was to open it and let it in and start bargaining with it, negotiating with it, trying to figure out what it wanted so it would go away. The hard part was leaving the door closed and sitting with the sound of the knocking, trusting that it would eventually stop. At 3:28, she walked to Patricia's office. The hallway was quiet. The post-lunch lull, that brief period of reduced activity when everyone was either at their desks or in meetings, and the corridors were empty, and the fluorescent lights buzzed their single, persistent note. She knocked on Patricia's door, which was already slightly ajar, and Patricia's voice said, "Come in," with the clipped efficiency of a person who had said, "Come in" 10,000 times, and had long since stopped investing any warmth in the syllables. Patricia's office was large and clean and devoid of personality. There were no personal photographs, no art on the walls, no objects that suggested a human being lived in this space. There was a desk, a computer, a chair, a filing cabinet, and a small table with 2 chairs across from the desk, arranged for the kind of quick conversations that were neither quick nor conversational. The only decorative element was a single plant, a snake plant, sturdy and indestructible, the kind of plant that could survive in an office with no natural light and no emotional warmth. Sitting on the windowsill behind Patricia's desk. Sit down, Aliner. Patricia gestured to one of the chairs across from her desk. She was not smiling, but she was not frowning either. Her face was in its default state, neutral, controlled, giving away nothing. Aliner sat. "I'll get right to the point," Patricia said. "We're creating a new role. Senior Content Strategist. It would report directly to me. I'd like you to take it." Aliner blinked. Of all the scenarios her mind had constructed in the 90 minutes since receiving the email, this had not been one of them. The role would involve overseeing all content across the division, not just the reports you've been working on, but the client-facing materials, the internal communications, the web content. You'd have a team of 3, a budget, a real say in how things are done. Patricia paused, and something shifted in her expression. Not warmth exactly, but a slight softening, a crack in the professional facade. "You're one of the most competent people in this division, Aliner. You've been doing the work of someone 2 levels above you for years, and we both know it. This is an attempt to make that official." Aliner said nothing for a moment. She was processing. Not the offer itself, that was clear enough, but the feelings that accompanied it. Because what she felt, sitting in Patricia's sterile office with the snake plant watching from the windowsill, was not excitement or relief or vindication. What she felt was a quiet, clear, almost surgical question. Do I want this? It was not a question she had ever asked herself before. Not about work, anyway. Work was something that happened to her, not something she chose. She had taken this job 7 years ago because it was available and she needed a job, and it seemed fine. She had stayed because leaving seemed complicated, and because inertia was a powerful force, and because she was good at it, and being good at something was a reason to keep doing it. even if the doing had long since stopped being meaningful. She had never paused in 7 years to ask, "Is this what I want?" She asked it now. Sitting in Patricia's office, being offered a promotion, being told she was competent and valued and deserving of more, she asked the question, and she waited for the answer. And the answer was not no, but it was not yes either. The answer was, "I don't know." "I'm honored," Alina said, and she meant it. "I need some time to think about it." Patricia raised an eyebrow. In the vocabulary of Patricia's facial expressions, a raised eyebrow was the equivalent of a stunned silence. "Take a week," Patricia said. "But I should tell you, you're the only person I'm offering this to." "Thank you," Alina said. "I appreciate that." She stood up and left Patricia's office and walked back to her desk and sat down and stared at her computer screen without seeing it. Her mind was not racing. It was not constructing scenarios or composing responses or cataloging implications. It was just sitting with the question, the way you sit with a feeling you can't name, holding it gently, waiting for it to tell you what it was. The rest of the afternoon passed in a kind of fog. She did her work, or at least she went through the motions of doing her work, but her attention was divided. Part of her was at her desk, typing, and part of her was in Patricia's office, sitting in the chair across from the desk, hearing the words "senior content strategist," and feeling the question open up inside her like a door she hadn't known was locked. She left the office at 5 p.m., earlier than usual, because the fog made focused work impossible, and because the alternative was sitting at her desk staring at nothing, which was depressing in a way that going home and staring at nothing was not. And she walked to the train station through the rain, which had not stopped all day and showed no signs of stopping. On the train, she did not read. She held the Spain book in her lap, but did not open it. She looked out the window at the dark, wet tunnel and thought about the question, do I want this? It was such a simple question. 3 words. A subject, a verb, an object. And yet it contained multitudes. Because embedded in the question were other questions, deeper questions, questions she had been avoiding for years, possibly for her entire adult life. Questions like, what do I want? Not what should I want? Not what am I expected to want? Not what would be impressive or practical or responsible to want. But what do I, Alina Graves, actually want? She didn't know. She realized with a clarity that was both illuminating and deeply uncomfortable that she did not know what she wanted. Not just about the job, about anything, about her life, about the way she spent her days and her evenings and her weekends, about the apartment she lived in and the city she lived in and the person she was becoming. She had been so busy doing what was expected, meeting demands, fulfilling obligations, responding to emails, cooking pasta for birthdays, sitting in